Good afternoon. Welcome to the libraries. I'm Michelle Light, Director of Special Collections, and I want to welcome you here today. We at the libraries are so thrilled to host Shakespeare's first folio as it is touring its way around the country to celebrate 400 years of Shakespeare's legacy. How many of you have seen Shakespeare's first folio over in Special Collections? Okay, almost every hand. I want you to tell all your friends, all your family members who live here, all your students to come see Shakespeare's first folio. It's probably a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to see it in Las Vegas, and it's only over in Special Collections for 7 more days, so time is limited. Shakespeare's first folio is very important to our culture because it included 36 of Shakespeare's plays, 18 of which had never been printed before. So without it, plays like Macbeth, Twelfth Night, As You Like It, The Tempest might have been lost forever. So 750 folios were printed 7 years after Shakespeare's death. 235 survive, and 82 of them are actually at the Folger Shakespeare Library. So we have the Folger Shakespeare Library to thank for dreaming up the possibility to circulate, I think, about a dozen folios to 52 spots around the country. We have the Folger Shakespeare Library to thank for making it possible for thousands and thousands of people to come see Shakespeare's first folio in person, but also the American Library Association and the Cincinnati Museum. The National Endowment for the Humanities, Google, and other generous sponsors have also made the tour possible, as well as many people here at the UNLV. There are many UNLV libraries, faculty, and staff who have helped make our month of Shakespeare possible, our campus facilities, and participants for over 15 events that we've held here to make your experience with the folio so much richer. So now I'd like to move on and introduce and thank our expert speaker today. John Bowers is a professor and past chair of UNLV's English department and also a Barrick Distinguished Scholar whose work has been supported by fellowships from the NEH, the Huntington Library, and the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation. A specialist in medieval English literature with books on Chaucer, Langwind, and the Gowan poet, Professor Bowers' latest book project, Tolkien's Lost Chaucer, is based on a long-forgotten edition discovered in an Oxford archive. Dr. Bowers taught Shakespeare courses at Princeton and University of Virginia before joining the English department at UNLV, and he has regularly taught Shakespeare's histories and comedies over the past 20 years here in Las Vegas. He included 2 lectures on Shakespeare, Hamlet, English Literature Goes Global, and Brave New Worlds, The Tempest, in his Great Courses series, The Western Literary Canon in Context. His article, I Am Marble Constant, Cleopatra's Monumental End, published in the Huntington Library Quarterly, explored the imagery of the Renaissance tomb monuments that carries over to the introductory materials of the first folio. Please welcome Dr. Bowers.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and I'd like to take this opportunity also to thank Priscilla Finley, who's up here in the front row, who has done a really heroic work on pulling all of this together. And for those of us in the English department, huge gratitude to her for helping us with the books that we need for our research and our teaching as well. This is not so much a lecture as in the sense of a talk from notes that I've just been gathering over the last a month or so in preparing this. I accepted the invitation not because I was an expert on the first folio, but because I really didn't know very much about the first folio. So this was a great opportunity to learn a lot, and I was reading new stuff even this morning, so this is very much in the nature of note-taking at this time. The great expert on the first folio, Charlton Hinman, who studied all the folios at the Folger Library, said of the book that it is not very rare and it is not a very beautiful book. And here we have the famous opening page, and you can see it really isn't a very beautiful book. It isn't decorated, it isn't colored, the initials are not painted in. It's a pretty plain Jane kind of book in a way, and it isn't particularly rare. One of the sources I found said there are 230 copies. The exhibition over here says 233. Michelle just said there are 235. Whichever way, there's a lot of copies of it around. And the Folger Library in Washington has 82 of them. So it is not really a rare book. I mean, there are some books that survive in one single copy, but the First Folio isn't one of them. It is a big book. There are 900 double-column pages in it, and it took a long time to produce, 22 months during the year 1622, 1623, with a couple of interruptions in that. And as we see, it's printed in double columns. This is the sort of book you would expect of a very serious or even religious book like the King James Version of the Bible was done in double columns. And it's really something that carries over till today. If you've got your complete works of Shakespeare and the Riverside Shakespeare, they're still printed up in double column editions. And as big a book as it is, and as we'll see, it's a pretty pricey book, it was actually cheaper to do it this way than to publish in individual quarto editions, the smaller editions. And in fact, in 1619, before this, they actually started a series of quartos, like there were individual volumes, and it turned out to be prohibitively expensive. They weren't flying off the shelf. And so the First Folio was actually a cheaper, more economical answer for bringing together all of Shakespeare's works. As we've already heard, it contains 36 plays, and 18 of them had not been previously published in quarto edition. And that means if not for the First Folio, among the plays we would have lost would be The Tempest, Measure for Measure, Comedy of Errors, Taming of the Shrew, Twelfth Night, The Winter's Tale, Coriolanus, Julius Caesar, Macbeth, and Antony and Cleopatra. Those are just the ones that I would really, really miss. They're the plays that we teach in our courses and so on. Now, there are other plays that would have survived in quarto editions, but they're what we call the bad quartos. We would have had Richard III and we would have had King Lear, but they would have been in much worse condition if we didn't have the better texts that are offered by the First Folio here. The title of this tour, The Book That Gave Us Shakespeare, is really good advertising, but it also kind of skews the whole approach to the First Folio. It gives us a specific kind of Shakespeare. It's the kind of Shakespeare that the First Folio introductory material actually wanted. The idea of an author, a genius, somebody who's producing great artwork, an artwork that will last the test of time. Now that was really sort of optimistic, Pollyanna, pie-in-the-sky stuff when the First Folio came out, but it was a kind of version of its own history that became true over time. In reality, Shakespeare was a writer of the theater. He was sending these scripts off, and there was obviously, anyone who's worked in the theater will know this, there's a lot that goes on in rehearsal. They decide that speeches don't work, there's rewriting, the actors complain, things change in the production itself. When a play went on the road, they would shorten the text. When they revived it, they would revise the text. And so there was not really this sort of perfect text that Shakespeare was delivering. And he wrote them to be sold. I mean, he really was in it for the money. He was a kid from the country, came to London to make his fortune. And once he sold the play to the company, it was no longer his. The rights went to the company from that point on. And so all the cuts and things that went on, out of his control. One thing we do know, comparing Shakespeare's plays with others from the period, he tended to write longer plays than most during the period. He actually mentions the 2-hour traffic. Most of his plays would last longer than 2 hours. And so you have a famous, like the Kenneth Branagh production of Hamlet, which is uncut. I mean, that's really unusual, and it would have been unusual in Shakespeare's time also. In fact, the version of Macbeth that we seem to have was one cut down for indoor production during Shakespeare's lifetime. And so during his lifetime, playwrights were not all that famous. They weren't authors in the modern novel sense of a bestseller. They were much more like TV writers or screenwriters. I mean, you may love a movie, but not necessarily know who wrote the script for a movie. And that was very often the case in those times. I want to look pretty closely at the prefatory material that was published. This is the most famous of it. And one thing to note is that these prefatory poems and introductions were the last thing done in the printing process. And in fact, the various ingredients in the introduction appear in different order in different versions of the folio. As many of you know, no two folios are identical. They changed, they corrected every printing of the folio slightly different. It starts off with this little poem here called To the Reader by B.I., and that's probably Ben Jonson, who is also involved in this. And Jonson here and later on really has an uphill challenge. He's trying to make the case that what we got in front of us is literature. And plays during the period really didn't claim that status. They were more ephemeral, sort of like ballads and broadsheets and that sort of thing. So making the claim for Shakespeare's plays as literature is one of the things that this whole introduction is about. And in fact, there's something very revolutionary, experimental, you could say, about this, Shakespeare's comedies, histories, and tragedies. It was the first English book which consisted entirely of a large collection of scripts commercially performed outdoors. And that's a quotation from the expert Gary Taylor. So it's the first time you've got a large collection of plays that were commercial. These weren't university plays, and they were done outdoors. That was thought to be really kind of low class. The private theaters indoors were sort of high class, but the commercial theaters outdoors, not so much. One thing that the dedication here talks about is the portrait in brass. Of course, there was an engraving for the print here, but it's also reminding us, if I can get my mouse to work here, it was the custom at the time for church tombs to have brass memorials with pictures of the deceased. And so the reference here to the brass picture of Shakespeare reminds us he's dead. And then he says, so don't even pretend to look for the book or look for the picture, but look at the book. That's the final urging here. And here and later on, there's going to be this sense of literary immortality, that Shakespeare is giving us something for the ages, and he himself will last as well. And again, this is a kind of a novelty during the period, the idea of artistic immortality. Now, Shakespeare actually uses this idea in some of his sonnets. Number 18, Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day? It ends with this sort of claim of the sort of lastingness. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. So Shakespeare in the sonnets, anyway, has that confidence that literature lasts, but you don't get that in the plays. He seems to have thought, okay, I'm just kind of making some money in the theater, sending it off to things. We know that the portrait actually cost 44 shillings, which we'll talk about calculating money. It's somewhere between $500 and $150,000 in today's money. And so they thought this was a good investment. They wanted the picture on the cover. And yet it's again sort of doctored up. We have another portrait thought to be of Shakespeare, the Chandos portrait. And notice it's a very different image of Shakespeare. He's got longer hair, he's unshaven, he's got an open collar, and look at the earring. This is a man of the theater. This is sort of a rake, a man about town kind of character. But the first folio portrait has neatened him up. His hair is combed, he's shaved except for a little pencil mustache there. He's got a very starched collar now. They sort of made him respectable, a very gentlemanly like character here. He's very much a sort of Protestant gentleman. If this were a memorial of a Catholic, for example, his eyes might be looking to heaven. But this one is looking at the reader, which is kind of interesting, creating a kind of intimacy, a kind of relationship with the reader. And Gary Taylor thinks that one reason there's such a prominent portrait of Shakespeare is not that he was a famous writer, but because he was a famous actor. People knew what he looked like from the stage. He appeared not only in his own plays, but he appeared in other plays of the period. And actors are always more famous than the people behind the scenes. And so people could see this, oh yeah, I saw that play. He played the ghost in Hamlet. Yeah, I remember him. And so the selling point here was of the actor more so. I mean, that's still how movies are marketed, who's starring in it, you know, who's the actor. And so that seems also to have been part of the, and in fact there were contemporary portraits of other famous actors like Edward Allen and Richard Burbage. And of course that Chandos portrait of Shakespeare, again, not because he was a famous writer, but because he was a famous actor and man of the theater. The title up here, which I seem to have lost, there we go. His name is very large, Comedies, Histories, and Tragedies, but it doesn't say collected works or complete works. That's not really the selling point here. It tells us what we're going to get. And notice comedies first. They always knew, like many of us knew, that we like comedies better than tragedies and histories. They kind of sandwiched in. The histories are always kind of a hard sell in the classroom and other places. And in fact, they were printed separately. And there was a idea that you could actually buy one volume. You could just get the comedy volume or just get the tragedy volume separate at that time. The real selling point here is not completeness, but true original copies. Remember, these quartos were floating around, and some of them were pretty darn bad. Poor copy. But now the selling point is that you get the original copies. And there's some false advertising here. Because what we know now is that we didn't get them straight from Shakespeare. The first 5 plays in the first folio are actually printed from a fair copy made by a professional scribe named Ralph Crane. And he was very fussy about punctuation. And so the early plays in the first folio have more punctuation you ever want. And that's not Shakespeare. That's the copyist who is hired to do fair copies of this. Also, a lot of the plays were actually typeset from these quarto editions that were already floating around. Sometimes they were corrected and edited, and sometimes they were just printed in the first folio from those previous quarto editions. And there was a real practical advantage to doing that. And I've learned this from reading up now. When the printer is setting type, he has to do what he calls a casting of the original. And that means they have to figure out how many pages they need for the play, but also how many lines will fit on each page. Because in the printing process, they have what they call sixes, so they take 3 folio leaves and fold them once. That gives you a big, big page size. But in the printing process, you would print page 1 and 12 in the same tray. So you need to know how many lines and which lines are going to show up on page 12, and then 2 and 11 and 3 and 10. So you really, really know where you, as a printer, where you're going with the text. And so it was much easier with the quartos, which were already printed, to figure out how many lines per page. And so that was fairly practical. And some of the plays in the first folio that were printed from these prior editions, Merchant of Venice from a corrected version of the first quarto, Midsummer Night's Dream from an annotated, maybe the author's own annotated copy of second Quarto. Romeo and Juliet, just a reprint of the third Quarto of that play. Other plays have more of a claim as being the author's original. Comedy of Errors seems to have been printed from Shakespeare's own draft, what they call foul papers. Twelfth Night from the prompt book, or the official script that had been used in the theater for performance. Macbeth, a prompt book for that shorter version indoor. And then Coriolanus, thought to be a high-quality transcript by Shakespeare himself. So that's one of the plays that's pretty darn close to what Shakespeare actually wrote, his own copy of that. What else do we get here on the title page? Down here at the bottom, published in London, that's where everything was published, printed by Isaac Jaggard and Edmund Blount. And of course, the date 1623. These are the investors. There had to be capital, there had to be money behind this because it was a pretty expensive project. But these were the guys who also had something to gain if there was money to be made. I mean, this wasn't just done as a labor of love. Some of the opening poems make it sound as just commemorative, we're doing this for a friend. But I mean, it really was hopefully a money-making proposition. And because it was expensive, they actually had a syndicate of backers, in addition to the two whose names appeared on the title page. And that's because it was going to cost £250 in 1623 money to make this happen. And let me see if I can, here we go. And that's an astronomical amount of money. A shoemaker in those days earned £4 a year. And here, a book was going to cost £250 to produce. And most of the cost, 70%, is paper. Labor much cheaper in those days, material much more expensive in those days. And it's always kind of a brain tease trying to figure out equivalences of money over the centuries. And there's a great website that I recommend to you. It's called measuringworth.com. And what you do is you plug in the amount of money, you plug in the year you're talking about, and it will give you the modern equivalents. But again, there's no simple way of figuring that out. So the $250 in production might be $54,000 using retail price index, $860,000 using average earnings, $2 million in change, or $16 million in change as a percentage of the gross domestic product. So you sort of take the median figure of $860,000 in contemporary money. That's a big investment for somebody to pour into this. And when it hit the streets, it was selling for 15 shillings. The first edition, the first folio in 1623. And again, it's kind of a big question. How much money was that in contemporary times? And sort of ranges from $161 to $2,500 and change, all the way up to $50,000 there as a rough equivalency. But if you just say the $2,500, that's a lot of money. I mean, who has that much money to invest in a single book? And this isn't even a rare book, it's just a new book at the time. And so, you know, when it hit the booksellers, the stationers, it was a pretty hefty sell. And the syndicate needed to sell 333 of them just to break even. And it's a big question about whether they hit the mark on breaking even with the first folio. The evidence suggests it did not sell well. It was 9 years before the second folio came out. And compared to other publications from the period, that's a long lag time before you get a second edition of the book. There were disadvantages. Other smaller books, peddlers could actually go around London selling them on the street. This book was too big to do that. They even had peddlers who would stand outside the playhouse hawking copies of the Quartos. And again, this book was too big to sort of stand outside the stage door offering it to customers when they leave the theater. So they were upstream on this. And we know enough about Edward Blount, who was one of the main backers. He seemed to have been ruined financially by this venture. In the 20 years before the first folio, he had actually published 72 titles. In the 3 years after the first folio, he published nothing. He ended up losing his bookshop. He ended up losing his copyright on Marlowe as well as Shakespeare. And he ended up taking charity loans at the end of his life. He seems basically to have been bankrupted by this venture of publishing the first folio. And so as a commercial venture, it didn't do too well. But remember, besides a commercial venture, this was also commemorative. I mean, people really had known Shakespeare in his lifetime, and they did want to honor him and be sure that his name got known. And it's interesting, in earlier Quarto editions, Shakespeare's name didn't always appear on the cover, on the title page. Here's Romeo and Juliet in the Quarto edition from 1597. An excellent conceited tragedy of Romeo and Juliet, blah, blah, blah. Shakespeare's name not there. Henry V. The Chronicle History of King of Henry V, blah, blah, blah. Shakespeare's name not there. Seemed to be much more important who the actors were, what the company was. People more readily identified and thought that was a selling point. The name of the playwright, not so much, not so much. Now, if you go over here next door to look at the copy of the first folio that's been lent to us, they have a digitalized copy from the Folger library. You can actually flip through, look at every single page. I'm going to take us to the Oxford's Bodleian Library digitalized version of the first folio. It's also complete. And what I kind of like about it, if I can get there. What I like about it, it's not so pretty. It's a book that's been used. And we have to remember, when these were first being sold in 1623, people didn't say, whoa, this is going to be valuable one of these days. It was just, you know, a really sort of interesting book, and they wanted to read it, and they did read it, and they made it messy along the way. And like a lot of first folios, this one has a history, and we know something about its history. If you'll bear with me a moment, I'll tell you about this one. In 1610, a man named Sir Thomas Bodley decided to set up a library in Oxford, and it's still there. It's the famous Bodleian Library, named after Sir Thomas Bodley. And here was the gimmick. Every book published in England, the publisher would have to donate or deposit a copy with the Bodleian Library. So they got free donations from every book published. And so in 1623, when the first folio came out, its publisher, Isaac Jaggard, donated a copy to the Bodleian Library. So it's great. Bodleian Library gets the first folio. However, by 1664, the librarians are going through their collection, and they decide the first folio is now superfluous because it's been superseded by the third folio. It's newer and better. And what makes it better? It's got more of Shakespeare's plays in it than the first folio. It has The Puritan Wife. It has A Yorkshire Tragedy. It has more of Shakespeare's. Could I see a show of hands? How many have read Shakespeare's play, A Puritan Wife? No. These are spurious plays that became part of the Apocrypha. If you want them to sell, say Shakespeare wrote them. And so the third folio had these spurious additions to it. Anyway, so what happened to the first folio? They sold it off to a local Oxford bookseller, and it disappeared after 1664. Flash forward to 1905. This guy shows up at the Bodleian Library with the first folio. He says it's been in his family since the 18th century, but it's kind of in bad repair. and he wanted some advice on repairing the family copy of the First Folio. The librarians look at it and they decide this was our First Folio that we stupidly sold off in 1664. And so they launched this big campaign to buy it back. And they get subscriptions from the general public. They were, of course, bidding against these rich Americans like Henry E. Huntington and Henry Clay Folger. And so in the end, they got to keep it, but it was the most money ever paid for an English book at the time, so that the Bodleian could buy back its own copy of the First Folio. And as you see, it's ripped. The dedication page had disappeared, and so it was replaced, and somebody wrote in the to the reader section there before. But let's look at the introductory material here. Just tap the page and it turns. It's kind of neat. And so the first thing you get here is dedication to the noble pair of brethren. The Earl of Pembroke, who was the Lord Chamberlain to King James I, and his brother, the Earl Montgomery, was master of the king's bedchamber. And so if you want a book to sell, dedicate it to somebody well-known, somebody famous and noble and aristocratic. And so that's going to be one of the selling points. And it said that these two men who were very culturally active knew the plays when they were first performed and actually knew Shakespeare. And Pembroke was actually the master of the revels. He was the one responsible for getting the plays done at court. And a lot of Shakespeare's plays were done at the royal court of James I. And so these were people who had hands-on experience of Shakespeare's plays during the time. And move on. And here we get the names of the two people who are doing the dedication. And they turn out to be colleagues of Shakespeare's from his acting days. So that John Hemming and Henry Condell identify themselves as friends of Shakespeare and hope that they have done a service when they have collected the plays and done an office to the dead to procure his orphans without ambition either of self-profit or fame, only to keep the memory of so worthy friend and fellow alive. Now, this claim that they weren't going to make any money off this is probably a little naive. They were the ones who were supplying the manuscripts here, so they were probably in on the cut. And in fact, there's an interesting thing. Shakespeare put a late codicil on his will, in which he left these two guys money to buy mourning rings, commemorative rings, after he died. And so it's almost a little bribe in advance. Don't forget me when I'm gone. And so they sort of had to follow through on that. But certainly they were going to be cut in on any profits. Or maybe they were paid up front. If I were them, I would have taken the money up front for delivering some of these copies from the theater that they had access to because they had been a fellow actor. Turns out, though, that the Herbert brothers, the two noblemen here, were sort of the target of a lot of commissions. They were culturally active, and it turns out there were 250 other works of the period that were dedicated to them. So it seemed like you just sort of went through the motions. You made your dedication to these two guys because they were kind of the go-to guys for publication during this time. So after doing this dedication to the noblemen, John Hemming and Henry Condell do a sort of pitch to the great variety of readers. And it's kind of interesting to go from one to the other because the tone of the address to the general buying public is so different from it. Tone changes. And they tell people, okay, you've probably seen these on the stage. They've already sort of passed the muster with people. So go ahead and read and censure. Quote, do so, but buy it first. okay, you want to read it, but be sure you buy it. And they actually say, quote, but whatever you do, buy. And so these are the guys who say that they're not really in this for commercial profit, but they're the ones who are telling the reader out there, be sure you don't just borrow it from a friend, buy your own copy along the way. They also make a claim that there's been some bad editions circulating out there they call maimed and deformed. But now what you're going to get in the first folio are texts that are cured and perfect of their limbs and absolute in their numbers. And it's an interesting sort of, these were maimed, but now the limbs are cured and perfect. There's a body image going on here. And what you get is this idea that there is a body of Shakespeare's works, what we now call the corpus, and that's the Latin word for body, a body of works. And now it's complete. We brought together all the dramatic works by Shakespeare, and the numbers are correct. And it's probably a play on words there. It means you get all 36 plays, the numbers, but also the meter, the scansion. The lines work now as poetry also, because the text is better than those earlier editions that you had seen before. Let me see if I can really... And next up, you get to the memory of the beloved, the author, Mr. William Shakespeare. And this is Ben Jonson. And this is the famous section of the introduction. First of all, because Ben Jonson was a playwright and an author in his own merit. He knew Shakespeare as a rival playwright for a long time. And so this dedication poem actually gives us some of the important lines, quotable quotes about Shakespeare. But it's interesting because they had been competitors in the theater for a long time. There's a kind of edginess. There's still a little residual envy built into this. For example, this is where we get that line, "Thou hadst small Latin and less Greek." Jonson was educated at university. Shakespeare wasn't. And so Jonson criticizes him for not being a very good Latinist and having hardly any Greek language at all. A little bit of a jab there that you might not otherwise expect. One thing that's made about Jonson, by the time he's writing this, he never was very prolific as a playwright. I mean, we know some of his plays like Bartholomew Fair, Sejanus. He was not as prolific as Shakespeare, and he was not as commercially successful as Shakespeare. And by 1623, he hasn't written a play in 7 years. And so, what is he doing at this point? Turns out collections like this usually had poems at the beginning commending the playwright and so on. Jonson writes tons of these during the period. And what he seems to be doing is casting himself as an arbiter of taste, as somebody whose criticism can be trusted, somebody who's a kind of cultural gatekeeper. And so he's giving his approval to Shakespeare in this commendation and ringing phrases like soul of the age, wonder of our stage, and then the great quotable quote, he was not of an age, but for all time. I mean, that really is, a banner quotation, but it also may have had a kind of commercial significance also, because the first folio, it turns out, was competing in the marketplace with a nifty new genre called news books. People were curious about what's happening, current events. They didn't quite have newspapers yet. So these news books were kind of like news magazines like Time and Newsweek, which we don't even have anymore in our culture. But they would tell you the news. And those were the hot items in the marketplace. And so Shakespeare was competing against them. And so Jonson says, those are just ephemeral. Those are of an age. But Shakespeare is not of an age. He's for all time. He also says of Shakespeare, sweet swan of Avon, what a sight it were to see thee in our waters yet appear. Kind of reminding people that Shakespeare was always kind of an outsider. He was not a native Londoner. He was from Stratford-upon-Avon, but by the same token, and make those flights upon the banks of Thames that so did take Eliza and our James. He does remind potential customers that Queen Elizabeth I, Eliza, and King James I, our James, were playgoers. They liked Shakespeare. And so, if you're a good, loyal Englishman, you'll like Shakespeare too. And then he also reminds the readers, and again, a little snideness built in here, Shakespeare is not buried in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. It had already become the custom since Chaucer for writers to end up in Westminster Abbey's Poets' Corner. And Shakespeare isn't there. He's buried in his hometown church in Stratford-upon-Avon, which is where he died. And so Jonson says here, "My Shakespeare, rise. I will not lodge thee by Chaucer or Spenser," there in Poets' Corner, "or bid Beaumont lie a little further to make thee a room. Thou art a monument without a tomb, and art alive still while thy book doth live." You don't need to be in Poets' Corner. You are a monument without a tomb and live in this book. And a pretty nice compliment, but it's one of those compliments that made itself true over time. The Shakespeare we know is the Shakespeare who lives in the plays that we have inherited. And a lot of criticism is kind of looking for Shakespeare's personality in his plays, looking for his religion, looking for his sexuality, a lot of searching in the plays for the man Shakespeare. And you can sort of pinpoint where that starts in Ben Jonson's commendation. He also says that the stage is dark but for your volumes. He's kind of predicting the fact that in future eras there's going to be revivals of Shakespeare's plays. Now in olden days when a play had kind of had its run, it was done. They wanted the next new thing. But Jonson's already predicting that in the future, Shakespeare's plays will be back on the stage. And it's not really until the 18th, 19th century that starts to happen, but already, and it's going to be made possible by First Folio. Some other front matter. Here's one by Leonard Digges called Shakespeare an Author. That's a very highfalutin title. It's usually reserved for classical authors like Virgil and Homer. Maybe Chaucer would be an author. But this is a pretty far reach for Shakespeare at this time to be called an author. And another little poem at the bottom of the page by James Mapp. It's just a little poem at the bottom, but it has this great conceit that Shakespeare isn't dead. He's just gone into the tiring room, that is the changing room at the theater, to do a role change, and he's going to come out again as soon as he's got his costume on. And it's a reference to the fact that in the Shakespearean theater, actors doubled roles. And so Shakespeare is just in the changing room. He's, for example, the same actor who played the ghost in Hamlet probably played King Claudius also. So several different, and the audience kind of recognized when the actor came out again. And so Mapp says, "An actor's art can die and live to act a second part. That's but an exit of mortality. This a re-entrance to applause." And so when you come back again in the new costume of the First Folio, we're going to applaud that, even though your previous character we're not going to see anymore. More front matter. The list of players. I was saying before that the actors were in their own time the famous ones in the theater. And so here they've included the list. And notice Shakespeare himself is listed first among the actors. As I say, that was a bigger selling point than saying, oh, by the way, he also wrote the plays. But this is also a kind of memorial, because all the actors here are dead too. This is why my title of the paper, Bring Out the Dead, is kind of appropriate. So besides Shakespeare, who died in 1616, Richard Burbage, dead in 1619, Augustine Phillips, dead in 1605, William Kemp, dead in 1603, Thomas Poole, dead in 1603, Robert Artram, the great comic actor, dead in 1615. And so, there you have a kind of necrology, but also kind of a kind of look back to the great actors of the period. Another little poem put in here by Hugh Holland refers to Shakespeare as a scenic poet. Interesting kind of term. And it suggests that, number one, people went to the theater mostly to hear the play. They didn't see as much action, business on stage as most modern productions. And so it was scenic. They would stand, there was costuming and so on, but a sense that, there wasn't as much sort of dramatic stuff on the stage as in our time. Here's the other famous plate that's usually reproduced in editions. It's the catalogue of the plays themselves, organized by genre. This was not automatic. When Ben Jonson published his plays in 1616, he arranged them in chronological order that he wrote them, and also gave the dates of the performances when they were premiered. The editors of the first folio give according to genre, history, comedy, history, and tragedy. And most modern editions still follow this. If you get the Riverside edition, you get the same thing. They've sort of put in another genre of romance, a few plays that don't seem to fit in that. And so and instead of trying to put them in chronological order as they were written, it's interesting with the history plays, they're put in order of English history, starting with King John and then going on to King Henry VIII. And so it's put in the order, the chronology of English historical events instead. We were talking about how fortunate we are to have a lot included in the first folio. There's some plays that you'd find in the Riverside Shakespeare that aren't here. For example, you get the Two Noble Kinsmen, Pericles, and probably this is because we don't like to admit it, but sometimes Shakespeare collaborated with another playwright, John Fletcher. And so the plays that are left out of the first folio are the plays that were collaborative efforts. John Fletcher is still alive and working at the time. He's actually the most successful playwright in London when the first folio is published. And there may have been problems in securing the rights of the plays since he was still alive. And then there's The Ghost in the Machine, a play called Cardenio. Show of hands, how many of you read Shakespeare's Cardenio? It's lost. We have records that it was being performed at court twice in 1613. Doesn't survive. Probably another collaborative effort. There was never a folio, never a quarto edition. Didn't make it into the first folio because written by Shakespeare with John Fletcher. So it's that famous lost play. We know it existed, but didn't make it in here. And finally, the play's the thing. We get to the text of the plays themselves, and it's kind of a surprise with The Tempest. As far as we know, The Tempest was actually the last play that Shakespeare wrote single-handedly, and yet they put it first. Probably, again, salesmanship. It's the one that potential customers remember, and so they put that first. But it has a funny kind of embalmed look about it. I mean, it's on the printed page now. Scripts kind of get stuffy when they get written down and in print like this. And remember, these are being typeset from the fair copies by the scribe Ralph Crane. And he actually inserted act and scene. He actually put it in Latin, acta prima, scena prima, act one, scene one. Shakespeare didn't do this. Shakespeare didn't need to do this. His plays were performed without break, without intermission, so there was no need to divide them into 5 acts. So this is done as a kind of literate gesture. Readers expect to see plays divided into act and scene, and so Ralph Crane had done that, and so it's printed up that way, looking a little more classy, a little more classical by that time. But as I say, it has a kind of stiffness that wasn't there. And so in the process of saving the plays for us, and we're really glad the First Folio does that, it is also beginning to offer itself over as an artifact. And it's going to become really kind of like a secular relic, something that has a special aura to it. And you know, it's treated like a sacred relic or secular relic. And I think this is where I need to. Go back. And if you go next door to the special collections here, you will find the First Folio in a glass case. And in fact, the local librarians cannot open the case. Somebody from the Folger Library in Washington needs to come and open the case because what's inside is way too valuable for those purposes. And as I say, this is treating it as if a kind of religious relic in a glass case. For example, this is Pope John the 23rd in the Vatican in Rome. This is what you do with authentic religious relics. You embalm it and put it in a glass case. And notice that's the same way the First Folio is now treated. And there's even a peculiar instance. In the 19th century, there was an American actor, Edwin Forrest, who had his own First Folio. And after he died, there was a house fire in 1872, and his copy of the First Folio mostly burned up. But of course, it's the First Folio, so even the ashes and the charred pages are still valuable. And so if you go to the rare book room at University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, they have a little sepulcher, a little entombment for the cremations of the First Folio. And to take it one step further in a kind of almost religious veneration, the Folger Library has a replica of the burned up copy in its own little secular entombment there. Okay, as I say, these are just sort of notes and thoughts from my own reading. I had hoped to leave more time here at the end for questions. Happy to get questions from the floor. I learned a whole lot more. For example, the First Folio was sold unbound because it was presumed that the customers would want to put their own special customized binding on the outside because they wanted everything to match up on the shelf. And if you look over in the special collections, they have a booklet called Folio Mania. And they have a lot of pictures of First Folios from the Folger. Everyone has a different cover, size, color, embossment, very, very personalized.
You describe how the pages are put together. Are they folded, or is it one page piled up and then folded in half?
Okay, somebody correct me if I don't get this right. What makes it a folio is it starts off with the large sheet of paper, and you fold it once. But you don't do, you know, one sheet at a time. You take 3 sheets. That's pretty crude. 3 sheets and fold it. So 3 sheets now give you 6 leaves, and each leaf has 2 sides on it, and so that gives you 12 pages. And these individual sections are called quires, and each one would be sewn individually. And then the quires would make up the book itself. But again, you have to be careful because once you fold it, it needs to be printed so that, you know, this is page 1 and this is page 12. So you have to really know what's going to be on page 12 when you're typesetting page 1 also. Yeah, they knew their stuff in those days. Good question. Are we running out the clock? Oh.
You said that the copy of Macbeth we have now is probably a shorter that they performed inside. So is that, are we pretty much certain that a longer one existed, we just don't have it?
Yeah, I think it's one reason Macbeth often ends up in high school because it's shorter than a lot of the other plays. And we know that Shakespeare typically wrote longer plays, so this one was shortened for some reason. And the smart money is that it was shortened for an inside performance. And some of the records we have is that the play would actually be performed as part of a larger party or festival. For example, Comedy of Errors was done part of a Christmas party. In fact, they got so raucous one night they didn't have time to do it, so they did it another night. Same thing with Twelfth Night. It was part of a big Christmas jamboree. And so those plays would be abbreviated to fit into the, you know, larger evening of revelry.
What is the value of this folio? The value, the value, I mean the cost, actual cost of the value of this folio. If it's been calculated how much it would cost.
But did you want to go back to that sort of list of relative value?
Yeah, I mean like this folio, how much, let's say, what would be the value in money?
Of the first folio today, if one went on the market?
Yes.
I don't know, Professor Rasmussen probably talked about that on Sunday. Is there one on the market lately?
The most expensive one sold at auction was for $6 million. One recently went for about $5 million. So they typically go between $2 and $5 million, depending on their condition. We don't know which folio we have. It's part of the security measures of the folio, so it will be revealed which one we have after it makes its way back to the folder. So we'll get a better understanding of just how good of condition it is and what its value might be if it was ever sold at market. But I'm pretty sure that the one over in Special Collections is in really good condition compared to a lot of them that have survived.
It is. When you go over there, notice, for example, that the pages have been gilded. That was something that was done by an owner since 1623. It's the sort of thing they would do to upgrade, make it part of their fancy collection, customizing. And of course, if some really famous person owned a first folio over the centuries, that also would up its value on the market today.
Perhaps this is a trivial question, but I was wondering why Ben Jonson's last name, his J, is written as an I in the texts.
That's just sort of a funny Renaissance convention. I's and J's are kind of interchangeable, and as a capital, it tends to be an I. As an internal letter in a word, it tended to be J.
Thank you.
All kinds of funny typography. I mean, if you look, you know, S's and F's look similar. U's and V's, you know, are used differently. And a W would very often just be two V's printed next to each other. In fact, the French call it a double V, the double V. And you see that very often in the printing also.
Professor Bowers, thank you so much for speaking with us today. The first folio can be viewed over in Special Collections right now. We also have a series of scene studies coming up on Saturday afternoon, and we have a musical performance coming up on Sunday.